Imagine losing everything your family built over 4 generations. The land your great-grandfather settled with nothing but hope and calloused hands. The fields where your father taught you to ride. The home where your mother's laughter once filled. Every room. Now picture watching it all slip away, penny by penny, acre by acre, until the bank notices pile higher than the bills you can't pay. This was Thomas Miller's reality, until a cream-colored envelope arrived with an offer too strange to believe, but too desperate to refuse. This is the extraordinary true story of a man who married one of Montana's wealthiest widows in a last-ditch effort to save his family's legacy, only to discover a fortune more valuable than all her millions. A fortune that would change not just his future, but his understanding of his entire past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Montana winters have a way of stripping men to their bones, revealing what they're made of when the thermometer drops below zero and the wind howls like a wounded animal. By February 2018, Tom Miller's third winter of drought, the cold had stripped away nearly everything: his pride, his options, his hope. All that remained was stubborn determination, the kind that looks an awful lot like denial to everyone except the man himself. The morning frost crunched beneath Tom's boots as he trudged across what remained of Sunrise Ranch, his breath clouding in the pre-dawn air. At 35, his face had weathered into something older, cracked at the corners of his eyes, permanently sunburned across the cheekbones, a perpetual furrow between his brows that hadn't been there 3 years ago. His hands, encased in worn leather gloves with the fingers nearly worn through, clutched a thermos of coffee that had gone cold while he checked fence lines that didn't need checking. Just keep him busy, he'd tell anyone who asked, though fewer people asked these days. The eastern horizon was just beginning to glow pink when Tom reached the highest point on the property, a rocky outcrop the locals called Eagle's Rest. From here, all 200 acres of Sunrise Ranch spread out before him, the weathered red barn his grandfather had built, the farmhouse with its sagging porch and peeling white paint, the empty pastures where 300 head of cattle should have been grazing. Now, barely a dozen animals remained, their ribs visible even from this distance. Tom unscrewed his thermos and took a swallow of the bitter coffee, his eyes drawn to the for sale signs marking the boundaries of the neighboring Spencer Ranch. 6 months ago, the Spencers had called it quits after 4 generations, accepting a California tech millionaire's offer to turn their working ranch into a vacation property. The final insult had been the swimming pool installation crew, bringing in water by the truckload while local ranchers watched their stock ponds evaporate in the relentless drought. Tom's phone vibrated in his pocket, his sister calling from Denver, right on schedule. He let it go to voicemail. He already knew what Lisa would say, the same thing she'd been saying for months. Sell while you still can. Start fresh somewhere else. Don't go down with a sinking ship. Easy for her to say. She'd left Pine Creek 15 years ago, trading Montana dirt for a downtown Denver condo and her boots for heels. She had a point. Of course she had a point, but Lisa had never understood what this land meant. Not really. The ranch wasn't just property. It wasn't just acreage and assets. It was the only connection Tom still had to 3 generations of Millers who'd poured their sweat, blood, and dreams into this soil. It was where his father had taught him to ride when his legs could barely reach the stirrups, where his mother had planted the cottonwood saplings that now stood as full-grown sentinels along the driveway, where he'd buried both of them, side by side, under the big sky they'd loved so fiercely. The thought of strangers walking these hills, tearing down the barn for some vacation monstrosity with a home theater and infinity pool, made Tom physically ill. He'd rather burn it all to the ground himself. But sentiment wouldn't pay the mortgage, or the property taxes, or the medical bills still lingering from his father's long battle with cancer 6 years ago. The brutal truth was that Tom had exactly 28 days before the bank foreclosed, and not enough cash to cover even a tenth of what he owed. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the frosted grass. Tom drained the last of his coffee and began the trek back to the house. He had a shift at Wilson's Feed and Supply starting at 8, a job he'd taken 6 months ago when the last of his cattle money ran out. Frank Wilson had been a friend of his father's and had offered the position with the perfect mix of practicality and dignity, making it feel less like charity and more like a business arrangement between neighbors. Needs someone who knows what they're talking about when these hobby ranchers come in asking for advice, Frank had said gruffly. Plus my back ain't what it used to be for lifting feed sacks. The pay was barely enough to keep the lights on and gas in his truck, but it was something. More importantly, it gave Tom somewhere to be, something to do, besides watching his family legacy crumble around him. The farmhouse kitchen was as cold inside as out. Tom had cut the heat to the bare minimum to save on propane. He made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, ate standing at the counter, then changed into a somewhat cleaner flannel shirt for work. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a man he barely recognized, thinner, grayer at the temples, with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. One day at a time, he told his reflection, the same words his father had repeated through every hardship. One day at a time had gotten the Millers through the Depression, through droughts and blizzards, through market crashes and personal tragedies. But Tom was starting to wonder if some problems were too big for that homespun wisdom. The 15-minute drive to town took him past other struggling ranches, some hanging on, others already gone to seed. Pine Creek itself was a town fighting for survival, Main Street lined with as many empty storefronts as active businesses. The railroad that had once made it a prosperous shipping hub had diminished in importance decades ago, leaving the town to slowly contract around its remaining economic pillars: agriculture, the lumber mill 20 miles north, and a small but growing tourist trade catering to hikers and fishermen in the summer months. Wilson's Feed and Supply occupied a corner lot across from the Pine Creek Diner, its faded green awning and hand-painted sign unchanged since Tom was a boy. He parked his truck in the employee spot, really just an unspoken agreement that the space behind the dumpster belonged to whoever was working that day, and let himself in through the back door. Frank was already there, coffee brewing in the ancient pot that lived permanently on the counter in the break room. He was in his 70s now, white-haired and stooped, but with hands still strong enough to cut twine with a quick twist and forearms ropey with muscle from decades of agricultural work. "Morning," Frank nodded, pouring a mug and pushing it across the counter. "Supposed to get a delivery of that new organic chicken feed today. The stuff those Westridge folks are always asking for." Westridge was the next town over, 30 miles away, but economically it might as well have been on another planet. While Pine Creek struggled, Westridge thrived, transformed by wealthy transplants from California and Seattle who'd fallen in love with Montana's beauty, but brought their urban expectations with them. They wanted organic everything, artisanal, coffee, boutique shopping, and authentic Western experiences that bore little resemblance to the actual work of running a ranch. "I'll make space in the back corner." Tom nodded, grateful for the hot coffee. His thermos had long since given up actually keeping anything warm. The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of routine tasks, helping customers, stacking feed, bags, ordering supplies, sweeping the constantly dirty floors. Tom found a certain peace in the simple physicality of the work, in being useful in a straightforward way that required no decisions beyond where to stack which product. It was nearly noon when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside, sending A jolt of adrenaline through Tom's system. Sheriff Dave Holden was a decent man, fair and kind, but these days his appearance usually meant foreclosure notices or other legal papers no one wanted to receive. The bell over the door jingled as Dave entered, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed almost apologetic. He nodded to Frank, then made his way to where Tom was inventorying fishing tackle. "Tom," he said, his expression unreadable, "got something for you." Tom braced himself, setting down his clipboard. "Let me guess, more paperwork from First Montana Bank." Sheriff Holden shook his head, reaching into his jacket. "Actually, no. This came to the station for you. Hand-delivered by some lawyer type from Westridge." He produced a cream-colored envelope, heavy paper with an actual wax seal securing the flap. It looked like something from another century, certainly not the kind of correspondence Tom normally received. "What's a Westridge lawyer want with me?" Tom asked, turning the envelope over. His name was written on the front in elegant cursive. "Thomas J. Miller." Dave shrugged. "No idea, but the messenger said it's urgent." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Said you're expected tomorrow at noon, and you'll understand when you read it." Tom broke the seal carefully, removed a single sheet of thick paper, and read the brief message written in the same formal cursive. "Mr. Thomas Miller, your presence is requested at Oakwood Estate tomorrow at noon. A matter of mutual benefit requires discussion. Transportation will be provided. Catherine Bell." Tom read the note twice, convinced he must be missing something. "Catherine Bell?" he said, looking up at Dave. "The Catherine Bell?" Dave nodded. "That's what I thought too. Strange business." Catherine Bell was a name known to everyone in 3 counties, the widow of railroad magnate Robert Bell, who'd built the line that connected Montana to the Pacific Northwest and amassed a fortune in the process. After Robert's death 15 years ago, Catherine had become something of a recluse, rarely seen in public, but still controlling the Bell Railroad Company and, according to rumors, numerous other business interests. At 70, she was said to be worth hundreds of millions, living alone in a mansion outside Westridge that most locals had never seen. What possible business could Catherine Bell have with a failing rancher from Pine Creek? Frank had wondered, over during the exchange, his curiosity evident. Catherine Bell. Haven't heard that name in years. She's still alive? "Very much so, apparently," Tom said, tucking the note back into its envelope. "And for some reason, she wants to see me tomorrow." Frank's eyes narrowed, his expression calculating. "Heard she's been buying up land all through the valley. Maybe she's got her eye on Sunrise Ranch?" The thought sent a cold wave through Tom's chest. It made a certain sense. Developers and investors had been circling the struggling ranchers, like vultures. But why not just call or send her attorney? Why the formal invitation? "Guess I'll find out tomorrow," Tom said, trying to sound nonchalant. After Dave left, Tom tried to focus on his remaining tasks, but his mind kept circling back to the mysterious invitation. By the time his shift ended at 5, he'd constructed and discarded a dozen theories, each more unlikely than the last. The drive home seemed longer than usual, the weight of uncertainty pressing down like the gray clouds gathering on the horizon. Fresh snow was forecast for tomorrow. February in Montana never gave up winter without a fight. At home, Tom built a small fire in the wood stove, more for the comfort than actual warmth. He made a dinner of canned soup and stale crackers, then sat at the kitchen table with the envelope propped against the salt shaker. A matter of mutual benefit. What mutual benefit could exist between a bankrupt rancher and one of Montana's wealthiest women? Tom had nothing to offer someone like Catherine Bell. No connections, no special skills beyond those of any rancher, no leverage of any kind, unless she wanted his land. It was the only logical explanation. But even that didn't make sense. If Catherine Bell wanted to buy Sunrise Ranch, she could simply wait a month and buy it from the bank for pennies on the dollar after foreclosure. Tom's phone rang again, Lisa, for the second time today. With a sigh, he answered. "Hey, sis." "Finally," Lisa said, her voice tinny through the poor connection. "I've been trying to reach you all day." Been working," Tom replied, though they both knew a single text would have sufficed as a response. "I talked to Marcus," she said, jumping straight to the point. Marcus was her husband, a real estate attorney in Denver. "He says we might be able to structure a short sale to minimize the damage to your credit score. It won't save the ranch, but it could give you a fighting chance to start over." Tom pinched the bridge of his nose, fighting back the flare of irritation. Lisa meant well. She was trying to help the only way she knew how. "Thanks," he managed. "I'll think about it." "There's no more time to think, Tom. The foreclosure, I know exactly how much time I have left," he cut in, sharper than he intended. Then softer. "Something came up today. Might be nothing, but I need to see it through before I make any decisions." "What kind of something?" Tom's eyes fell on the elegant envelope. "I got an invitation from Catherine Bell." The silence on the other end lasted so long, Tom thought they'd been disconnected. "Catherine Bell," Lisa repeated finally. "The railroad widow. That Catherine Bell. The very same. Wants to meet tomorrow at her estate." "Why?" "No idea. But I'm going to find out." Lisa's skepticism was audible. "Tom, be careful. People like that don't typically reach out to people like us unless they want something. People like us." The phrase stung, even though Tom knew Lisa hadn't meant it unkindly. Just a statement of fact. The Millers were working people, always had been. Not poverty-stricken, but firmly middle class until the recent downward spiral. They didn't move in circles that intersected with the Catherine Bells of the world. "I'll be careful," Tom promised. "How are the kids?" The conversation shifted to safer territory. Lisa's twin boys, now 11 and obsessed with soccer. Her husband's recent promotion. The weekend trip they were planning to Aspen. Tom listened and made appropriate responses, but his mind kept drifting back to the enigmatic invitation. After hanging up, Tom poured himself 2 fingers of the cheap whiskey he kept for what his father had called thinking occasions. He carried it out to the porch despite the cold, settling into the Adirondack chair his grandfather had built decades ago. The night was clear, stars sharp as ice chips in the black sky. In the distance, the mountains were ghostly shadows, their snow-covered peaks faintly luminous in the starlight. It was the kind of beauty that made a man feel small in the best possible way, part of something ancient and enduring. Tom sipped his whiskey, letting the burn warm him from within. Whatever Catherine Bell wanted, he would listen. At this point, he had nothing to lose except the final scraps of his pride, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. His father's voice seemed to whisper from the creaking porch boards. "This land doesn't belong to us, Tom. We belong to it." "I'm trying, Dad," Tom murmured to the night. "I'm trying." The black car arrived at precisely 11:30 the next morning. A sleek, late-model luxury sedan that looked comically out of place on the rutted driveway of Sunrise Ranch. Tom had spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, changing his clothes twice before settling on his newest jeans. Only one small tear near the pocket. A button-down shirt he saved for church on the rare occasions he attended, and his least scuffed boots. He'd even trimmed his beard, which had grown unruly over the winter months. The driver, a stone-faced man in a dark suit, offered no conversation beyond a curt "Mr. Miller" when Tom approached the car. The interior smelled of leather and some subtle cologne, the seats softer than any chair in Tom's house. As they pulled away, Tom resisted the urge to look back at the farmhouse. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, which would take them through Pine Creek, then east toward Westridge, along the two-lane highway that connected the communities. The drive took almost 45 minutes, the landscape gradually transforming from the working ranches around Pine Creek to the more manicured properties of Westridge. Here, ranches were more likely to be hobby farms owned by wealthy retirees, or vacation homes for people who visited a few weeks each year. The town itself had been carefully cultivated to maintain a Western charm that appealed to tourists. The storefronts restored to historic perfection, the sidewalks lined with tasteful planters, the streetlights designed to look like old gas lamps. Past Westridge proper, they turned onto a private road marked only by a discreet sign, Oakwood Estate, private property. The road wound uphill through dense stands of pine and spruce, eventually opening to reveal Oakwood Estate itself. Tom had heard about the Bell Mansion, but seeing it in person still took his breath away. The house was a sprawling Victorian structure, 3 stories of weathered stone and dark wood, with a wraparound porch and multiple gabled roofs. Ancient oak trees surrounded it, their bare winter branches creating intricate patterns against the grey sky. Behind the house, the land sloped away to reveal a panoramic view of the valley below. The car stopped at the foot of wide stone steps leading to the front door. Tom's door opened before he could reach for the handle. The driver suddenly materialized beside him. "Mrs. Bell is waiting in the sunroom," the man said, gesturing toward the house. "Simmons will show you the way." As if on cue, the front door opened to reveal an elderly man in a dark suit. Simmons, presumably, who stood at rigid attention, hands clasped behind his back. Tom climbed the steps, acutely aware of his work-roughened hands and the faint smell of wood smoke that clung to his clothes, despite his best efforts. "Mr. Miller?" Simmons nodded, his expression revealing nothing. "Please follow me." The interior of Oakwood Estate was like stepping into another world. The entryway opened into a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase, the walls adorned with paintings in ornate frames, the floors covered in richly patterned rugs that muffled their footsteps. Tom followed Simmons through a series of rooms, each more elegant than the last, until they reached the sunroom at the rear of the house. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling windows captured the valley view, flooding the space with winter light despite the overcast day. Plants in ceramic pots created a garden atmosphere, their green vitality a stark contrast to the snow-covered landscape. Outside, and there, seated in a high-backed chair positioned to face both the view and the door, was Catherine Bell. Tom's first impression was of fragility. Catherine was thin to the point of gauntness, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her posture unnaturally straight as if held together by will alone. But when she turned toward him, Tom revised his assessment. Catherine Bell's eyes were clear and sharp, studying him with the intensity of a hawk sighting prey. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. "Thank you for coming." "Mrs. Bell?" Tom nodded, uncertain whether to extend his hand or wait to be invited to sit. Catherine solved the dilemma by gesturing to a chair across from her. "Please." As Tom sat, Simmons materialized at his elbow. "Tea, sir?" Before Tom could respond, Catherine answered for him. "Mr. Miller strikes me as a coffee man, Simmons. Black, I would imagine." Tom couldn't help but smile slightly. "You'd be right, ma'am." "Coffee, then," Catherine instructed, "and leave us, please." Simmons withdrew silently, closing the sunroom doors behind him. For a moment, neither Tom nor Catherine spoke. She seemed content to observe him, her expression revealing nothing. Tom resisted the urge to fill the silence with nervous chatter, a habit his father had always criticized. Let them show their cards first, son. Finally, Catherine spoke. You have your grandfather's eyes. James had that same direct way of looking at a person, like he could see right through pretense. The casual reference to his grandfather caught Tom off guard. You knew my grandfather? A flicker of something. Amusement? Regret crossed Catherine's face. Pine Creek was much smaller then. Everyone knew everyone. No, she waved the subject away. But that's not why I asked you here. Simmons returned with a silver tray bearing coffee for Tom and tea for Catherine. After arranging everything to Catherine's exacting standards, he withdrew once more. Catherine waited until the door closed. I'll be direct, Mr. Miller. I know about your financial situation. I know Sunrise Ranch is weeks away from foreclosure. I know you've exhausted all conventional options to save it. Tom's fingers tightened around the delicate coffee cup. May I ask how you know all this? I make it my business to know things, Catherine replied simply, particularly about matters that might affect my interests. And how does my ranch affect your interests, Mrs. Bell? Catherine set her teacup down with precision. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Miller, one that would solve your financial problems and serve a purpose of mine as well. Here it comes, Tom thought. Some lowball offer to buy the ranch before the bank took it. Probably pennies on the dollar, but just enough to appeal to a desperate man. I'm prepared to clear all debts associated with Sunrise Ranch, Catherine continued. The mortgages, the tax liens, all of it. Additionally, I'll provide capital for improvements, irrigation systems, breeding stock, whatever is necessary to return the operation to profitability. Tom's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The amount she was describing would be over $1 million, far more than the land was worth in its current state. Why would you do that? He asked, unable to keep the suspicion from his voice. Because I need a husband, Mr. Miller, Catherine said as calmly as if she were discussing the weather, and you need a miracle. For a moment, Tom was certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry, what did you say? I said I need a husband, Catherine repeated. Temporarily, 6 months to be precise. During that time you would reside here at Oakwood, fulfill certain obligations I'll outline, and in exchange I will ensure Sunrise Ranch not only survives but thrives. Tom set his cup down carefully, afraid his shaking hands might drop it. Mrs. Bell, I don't understand. It's quite simple, she continued. A marriage of convenience. We would wed quickly, quietly. You would have your own quarters here. Of course. After 6 months, we would divorce amicably. You would return to your ranch and our business arrangement would conclude. Tom's mind raced, trying to make sense of the bizarre proposal. These obligations, what exactly would they involve? Nothing untoward, I assure you, Catherine replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. You would accompany me to certain social functions. You would meet with business associates on my behalf. And you would assist me with a project of personal significance, the details of which I'll share once we have an agreement. Why me? Tom asked, the question that had been burning since he'd received her invitation. You could hire anyone, lawyers, managers, consultants. I need someone with no connections to Westridge society, Catherine said. Someone honest, straightforward, with a reputation for integrity. You're from good stock, Mr. Miller. Your grandfather was known as a man of his word. Your father the same, and by all accounts you've followed in their footsteps, even when it would have been easier not to. The praise, unexpected and sincere, landed oddly on Tom's ears. There has to be more to it than that. Catherine studied him for a long moment. There is. But those reasons are my own, and they don't affect the terms I'm offering. Tom leaned, back in his chair, mind spinning. The proposal was outlandish, bizarre by any normal standard. Yet the alternative, losing the ranch, betraying 4 generations of his family's work, seemed equally unthinkable. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. "Then you lose your ranch next month," Catherine said matter-of-factly. "And I find someone else. The choice is entirely yours, Mr. Miller." From an inner pocket of her cardigan, she produced a slim folder and placed it on the table between them. "My attorney has drawn up the necessary documentation. Everything is outlined clearly. The marriage contract, the financial arrangements, and for your ranch, the terms of our eventual separation. Take it home, review it. I'll expect your answer by this time tomorrow." Tom made no move to touch the folder. "This can't be legal." "I assure you it is entirely legal," Catherine said. "Unusual, certainly, but within the bounds of the law. The only people who need to know the true nature of our arrangement are in this room." A knock at the door interrupted them. Simmons appeared, his expression unchanged. "The doctor has arrived, Mrs. Bell." Catherine nodded. "Our meeting is concluded, Mr. Miller. Simmons will see you out. The car will return you to Sunrise Ranch." She rose with surprising grace for a woman her age, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. At the door, she paused, looking back at Tom with those piercing eyes. "One more thing, Mr. Miller. Whatever you decide, I trust this conversation will remain between us." It wasn't a question, but Tom nodded anyway. "Yes, ma'am." After Catherine left, Tom sat for a moment, the folder untouched on the table before him. The whole encounter felt surreal, like a fever dream or a scene from someone else's life. Yet the folder was real enough, as was the ranch he stood to lose in 28 days. Finally, he picked it up and followed Simmons back through the labyrinthine house to the waiting car. The drive back to Sunrise Ranch passed in a blur, Tom's thoughts too chaotic to form coherent questions for the taciturn driver. By the time they reached the farmhouse, snow had begun to fall, fat flakes swirling in the headlights. Inside, Tom built a fire and sat at the kitchen table, spreading the contents of the folder before him. The legal language was dense and formal, but the essence was clear enough. Exactly as Catherine had outlined, a marriage contract with a predetermined end date, financial terms that would not only save Sunrise Ranch, but transform it, details of his duties as Catherine's husband, all thoroughly proper and businesslike. It was, in the coldest business terms, an extremely favorable offer, but marriage, even a temporary one, felt sacred to Tom in a way he struggled to articulate. His parents had been deeply devoted to each other, his grandparents the same. Marriage, in the Miller family, had always been about love, partnership, building a life together through good times and bad. This would be a transaction, a business deal using what should be a sacred bond as its vehicle. And yet... Tom thought of his father's final days, how the older man had gripped his hand with surprising strength, making him promise to keep the ranch in the family, if humanly possible. "This land is in our blood, son," he'd said. "It remembers us even when we're gone." Outside, the snow fell harder, accumulating on the windowsills. Tom poured himself another measure of whiskey and carried it to the porch, wrapping his father's old blanket around his shoulders against the cold. The land stretched before him, white and silent, the falling snow softening its contours. Generations of Millers had walked this ground, loved it, fought for it. Was he really considering a sham? Marriage to a stranger to keep it? What would his father say? His grandfather? And yet, the alternative was to lose it all, to break the chain that connected him to his ancestors and to whatever future might come after him. Tom raised his glass to the snowy night. "What would you do, Dad?" he asked the darkness. The only answer was the soft shush of falling snow and the distant call of an owl hunting in the twilight. But in that silence, Tom felt something settle within him, a clarity he hadn't expected. Catherine Bell was offering him a choice between two imperfect options: a loveless, temporary marriage that would save his heritage, or holding to his principles while losing everything that mattered. When he finally went inside, stamping snow from his boots, Tom knew what his answer would be. Whether it was right or wrong, he couldn't say, but it was the only choice he could live with. The next morning, he drove himself to Oakwood Estate, the agreement signed and tucked inside his jacket. The same butler met him at the door, showing him once again to the sunroom, where Catherine waited, dressed in grey wool that matched the winter sky outside. "You've made your decision," she said as he entered, a statement rather than a question. Tom nodded, removing the folder from his jacket. "I have conditions," he said, finding his voice rougher than he expected. "I won't sell any part of my ranch, no matter what. I won't do anything illegal, and I want to know exactly what this project is before we proceed." Catherine regarded him steadily. "The project is private but entirely legal. I give you my word." "That's not enough," Tom insisted, surprising himself with his boldness. "I need to know what I'm agreeing to." For a long moment, Catherine was silent, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, a small sound that seemed to deflate her rigid posture slightly. "Very well. The project involves creating a nature preserve from land currently owned by the Bell Railroad Company. I need someone I can trust to oversee the selection of parcels and the establishment of the Conservation Trust. Someone who understands land not just as a commodity, but as a legacy." It wasn't what Tom had expected, something mercenary or manipulative. Conservation was a cause he could actually support. "Why not just hire an environmental consultant?" he asked, still skeptical. "Because this project has personal significance beyond its environmental value," Catherine said carefully. "And because certain members of the Bell Railroad Board would oppose it if they knew my plans before they were legally established. As my husband, you would have standing they couldn't easily challenge." It made a certain kind of sense, though Tom suspected there was still more to the story than Catherine was revealing. But it was enough, a purpose he could reconcile with his conscience. He handed her the signed agreement. "Then I accept." Catherine took the folder without opening it, her eyes still fixed on his face. "The arrangements have been made. We'll be married tomorrow morning in the chapel here at Oakwood. No guests, no announcement, just the legal necessities." Tom nodded, a strange sense of unreality washing over him. 24 hours from now, he would be this woman's husband. A week ago, he hadn't known she was aware of his existence. "One last thing," Catherine said as he turned to leave. "I know this arrangement isn't what you would have chosen in an ideal world, Mr. Miller, but I hope in time you'll see it was the right decision for both of us." There was something in her tone, not quite vulnerability, but perhaps a hint of the human being behind the business-like facade. For the first time, Tom wondered what circumstances had led Catherine Bell to propose such an unusual arrangement. What need or fear or hope drove her to seek a temporary husband at 70 years of age? "I hope so too, Mrs. Bell," he replied quietly. As Tom drove back to Sunrise Ranch for what would be his last night there for 6 months, the snow had stopped, leaving the landscape transformed. Familiar shapes made strange by their coating of white. It seemed a fitting metaphor for the decision he'd just made, the sharp edges of his life now covered by something foreign, yet somehow beautiful in its way. Tomorrow, he would marry Catherine Bell and step into a world he barely understood. Whether that step would lead to salvation or regret, only time would tell. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bitterly cold, the temperature having plummeted overnight. Tom woke before sunrise in his childhood bedroom, the familiar creak of the old farmhouse settling around him. For possibly the last time, he thought, running his hand along the wooden windowsill where he'd once carved his initials as a boy. He packed methodically, clothes, personal items, a few photographs. Not much to show for 35 years of life. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the percolator that had been his mother's, drinking it black while watching the sun rise over the eastern fields. The light caught the fresh snow, turning it momentarily golden before fading to the more familiar white. At 9 o'clock, the now familiar black car arrived. The taciturn driver loaded Tom's single suitcase into the trunk without comment. Before leaving, Tom walked through each room of the farmhouse, committing details to memory: the worn spot on the living room rug, the height markings on the kitchen doorframe tracking his childhood growth, the slight warp in the hallway floorboards. Not goodbye, he told himself, just until summer. The drive to Oakwood Estate seemed shorter this time, the landmarks already becoming familiar. As they turned onto the private road leading to the mansion, Tom felt his stomach tighten. What he was about to do felt simultaneously like a betrayal of his principles and the only choice he could make. The contradiction left him nauseated. The car bypassed the main house, following a narrow lane that wound through a stand of pines toward a small stone chapel nestled among ancient oak trees. The building was simple but beautiful, with stained glass windows and a slender bell tower. A perfect postcard image of rural devotion, though Tom doubted it saw regular services anymore. Inside, the chapel was empty, save for 4 people. Catherine Bell, seated in the front pew. A thin, nervous-looking man Tom assumed was her attorney. An older woman who might have been a housekeeper, and a jovial, round-faced man in clerical collar who introduced himself as Judge Winters. "Not a minister," the judge explained, shaking Tom's hand vigorously. "Retired from the bench 5 years ago, but still licensed to perform marriages. Mrs. Bell thought you might prefer a civil ceremony." Catherine herself was dressed in a simple grey suit, her silver hair arranged immaculately, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She acknowledged Tom with a nod, but did not rise or offer any greeting. If the judge found this behavior unusual for a bride, he gave no indication. The ceremony was brief to the point of perfunctory. No music, no processional, no declarations of love or commitment. Just the bare legal necessities, words that bound them together in law while leaving their hearts untouched. "Do you, Thomas James Miller, take Catherine Elizabeth Bell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Tom hesitated for just a moment, the reality of what he was doing suddenly overwhelming. His voice, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. "I do. And do you, Catherine Elizabeth Bell, take Thomas James Miller to be your lawfully a wedded husband?" "I do," she replied, her voice clear and emotionless. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, with the bored efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. Catherine's attorney produced the marriage certificate, which they both signed. No rings were exchanged, no kiss sealed the union. A handshake between business partners would have held more warmth. And just like that, Tom Miller became the husband of one of Montana's wealthiest women, a union that would save his family's legacy while requiring him to live a carefully orchestrated pretense. "The paperwork for your ranch has been filed," Catherine informed him as they walked, separately, back to the waiting cars. "The mortgages have been satisfied, the tax liens cleared. When you return to Sunrise Ranch in 6 months, it will be free and clear." "Thank you," Tom said, the words inadequate but all he had to offer. Catherine's only response was a curt nod before she entered her car, leaving Tom to follow the housekeeper to the main house. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Harper, showed him to his quarters in the East Wing, a suite of rooms larger than his entire farmhouse, decorated in muted blues and grays. "Mrs. Bell has arranged for appropriate clothing," Mrs. Harper explained, opening the doors to a walk-in closet filled with suits, dress shirts, casual wear, and shoes, all in Tom's size. "Meals are served in the dining room at 7, 12, and 6. Mrs. Bell takes breakfast in her rooms, but expects your presence at lunch and dinner." She delivered this information with the detached efficiency of someone reading from an invisible script, then departed, leaving Tom alone in his new gilded cage. The first week passed in a blur of disorientation. Tom explored the mansion cautiously, feeling like an intruder despite his legal right to be there. Oakwood Estate was even larger than it appeared from outside. 3 stories of ornate architecture, with formal rooms downstairs and private quarters above, plus servants' areas and storage spaces tucked away behind discreet doors. The house staff, Mrs. Harper the housekeeper, Simmons the butler, a cook named Mrs. Winters, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, and various other employees who seemed to appear and disappear as needed, treated Tom with impeccable but distant politeness. They addressed him as Mr. Miller and responded to his requests promptly, but their manner made it clear they considered him a temporary addition to the household. Catherine herself remained an enigma. They shared lunch and dinner each day, making stilted conversation about safe topics, the weather, local events, books Catherine was reading. She never mentioned the true purpose of their marriage, nor did she reference the conservation project that was supposedly Tom's primary duty. Instead, she directed him to familiarize himself with the estate and provided a stack of books and reports on land conservation, suggesting he prepare himself for the work ahead. Tom dutifully read the materials, finding genuine interest in the subject despite his confusion about when his actual responsibilities would begin. At night, he would retreat to his suite, which felt simultaneously luxurious and isolating. He slept poorly, the silence of the mansion oppressive after a lifetime of farmhouse creaks and outdoor sounds. Sometimes he would open the windows despite the cold, just to hear the wind in the trees. On the morning of the 8th day, an envelope was slipped under his door, an invitation to join Catherine for a drive to inspect the first property being considered for the conservation project. Tom felt a surge of relief. Finally, something tangible to do beyond wandering the mansion like a ghost. They set out after lunch in a rugged Land Rover driven by Catherine herself, a surprise that shattered Tom's image of her as a delicate society matron. She handled the vehicle with confident ease, navigating the snow-covered back roads without hesitation. "I learned to drive on much worse roads than these," she explained when she caught his surprised expression. "Robert, my late husband, believed women should be self-sufficient. It was the first personal information she had volunteered about herself, and Tom seized the opportunity to learn more about this woman who was now, at least legally, his wife. "How long were you married?" he asked. 45 years, Catherine replied, her eyes on the winding road. "Robert died 15 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." Catherine's expression didn't change. It was a long time ago. They drove in silence for a while, the landscape opening up as they left Westridge behind. After about an hour, Catherine turned onto an unmarked dirt road that wound through dense pine forest before emerging at the edge of a spectacular valley. She stopped the Land Rover at a viewpoint that overlooked the scene. Below them stretched a pristine landscape, meadows, forest groves, and a meandering creek, all nestled between rolling hills. Even in winter, its beauty was undeniable. "Bell Creek Valley," Catherine announced. 5,000 acres owned by the railroad since 1910, one of the few undeveloped watersheds left in this part of Montana. When Tom stepped out of the vehicle, the cold air biting at his face, the valley seemed to unfold in all directions, wild and serene. "It's beautiful. It's also valuable," Catherine said, coming to stand beside him. "The board wants to sell it to developers for a resort complex. Golf courses, condominiums, the usual monstrosities. I've been blocking the sale for years, but they're becoming more insistent. And you want to turn it into a nature preserve instead." Catherine nodded. "The first of several, ideally. This watershed feeds into 3 counties. Once it's developed, the damage will be irreversible." Tom studied the valley with newfound interest, his rancher's eye assessing the land. The southern slopes would be ideal for wildlife habitat, good sun exposure, natural shelter. The meadows show signs of seasonal flooding. You'd want to establish buffer zones there to protect water quality. Catherine looked at him with what might have been approval. Exactly the kind of assessment I was hoping for. Your grandfather would have said the same thing. Again, that casual reference to his grandfather, as if she had known James Miller well. This time, Tom pressed the point. You keep mentioning my grandfather. How exactly did you know him? Catherine's expression shuttered. This valley was once called Heaven's Pocket by locals. Your grandfather used that name for it, that's all. She turned back toward the Land Rover. We should continue. There are 2 more parcels to see before dark. Tom followed, his curiosity unsatisfied, but sensing that pursuing the subject would be futile. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, giving careful consideration to each property Catherine showed him. A forested hillside with old-growth timber and a series of natural springs that formed the headwaters of a regional river system. By the time they returned to Oakwood Estate, darkness had fallen. Tom was surprised to realize he had enjoyed the day, the purposeful activity a welcome change from the aimless wandering of the past week. More than that, he found himself genuinely interested in the conservation project, which aligned with values his father and grandfather had instilled in him about land stewardship. You have a good eye for the land, Catherine remarked as they entered the house, the closest thing to a compliment she had offered since they met. I'll have the maps and surveys delivered to your rooms tomorrow. I'd like your formal assessment of each parcel by the end of the week. Tom nodded, pleased to have concrete work to focus on. I'll need more information about the legal framework for the Conservation Trust and the tax implications. My attorney will provide everything you need, Catherine assured him. Then, almost as an afterthought, you did well today, Mr. Miller. She disappeared toward her private wing before Tom could respond, leaving him with the strange sense that he had passed some sort of test he hadn't known he was taking. Over the next 2 weeks, Tom threw himself into the conservation project with unexpected enthusiasm. His suite became headquarters for the operation, maps and surveys spread across every available surface, notes accumulating in careful stacks. Catherine had provided access to experts, environmental scientists, legal consultants, tax specialists, whom Tom consulted regularly by phone. The work engaged parts of him that had lain dormant during his years of financial struggle. His intelligence, his problem-solving abilities, his capacity for strategic thinking. For the first time since his father's death, Tom felt intellectually challenged and professionally useful. Catherine, too, seemed to thaw slightly as the project progressed. Their conversations at meals became more substantive, focused on conservation strategies and legal approaches to protecting the land. Though she maintained her formal demeanor, Tom occasionally glimpsed something else beneath the surface. A genuine passion for preservation, a deep knowledge of Montana's ecosystems, and a subtle wit that surfaced rarely but effectively. Still, their relationship remained strictly professional. Catherine never discussed personal matters, nor did she invite such confidences from Tom. The true nature of their arrangement, a marriage in name only, remained firmly in place, with separate living quarters and carefully maintained boundaries. The first real disruption came 3 weeks into their marriage, when Catherine informed Tom over breakfast that they would be attending a charity gala the following evening. The Westridge Hospital benefit, she explained, a significant annual event. As my husband, your presence is expected. Tom set down his coffee cup, unease creeping through him. This would be our first public appearance together. Yes, Catherine acknowledged, which makes it particularly important that we present a convincing picture of a married couple. We needn't be demonstrative, but we must appear comfortable together. Tom nodded slowly. I'm not exactly experienced with high society events. You'll be fine, Catherine assured him, though her tone suggested this was more command than comfort. Simmons has arranged formal attire for you. We'll depart at 7 tomorrow evening. The following night found Tom standing before the mirror in his suite, barely recognizing himself in the tailored tuxedo that fit perfectly despite never having been fitted. His hair had been trimmed by a barber Catherine had summoned to the house, and the overall effect was a transformation from rancher to gentleman that felt like the most elaborate costume he'd ever worn. Catherine, when she met him in the foyer, was equally transformed. Gone was the austere grey clothing she typically wore around the estate. In its place, a midnight blue evening gown that managed to be both elegant and flattering, her silver. Hair arranged in a sophisticated style, diamonds at her ears and throat. Despite her age, she cut an impressive figure, regal, confident, every inch the wealthy widow of a railroad magnate. "You clean up well, Mr. Miller," she observed, her tone neutral but not unkind. "As do you, Mrs. Miller," Tom replied, using her married name for the first time. Something flickered across Catherine's face, surprise perhaps, or some emotion Tom couldn't identify, before her composed expression returned. "Shall we?" The Westridge Community Hospital occupied a sprawling campus at the edge of town, its newest wing, the Bell Pavilion, Tom noted, hosting the annual fundraising gala. As their car joined the line of luxury vehicles disgorging expensively dressed attendees, Tom felt his anxiety spike. "Relax," Catherine murmured as they approached the entrance. "You're my husband. Act like you belong." Tom offered his arm, and Catherine placed her hand lightly upon it, their first physical contact since the handshake that had sealed their business arrangement. The touch, though formal and distant, somehow steadied him. Inside, the hospital atrium had been transformed into a glittering reception hall, with champagne fountains, ice sculptures, and floral arrangements larger than some of the shrubs on Tom's ranch. A string quartet played in one corner, while uniformed. Waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Catherine moved through the crowd with practiced ease, navigating the social currents as skillfully as she had driven the Land Rover through mountain roads. She introduced Tom simply as "my husband," offering no explanation for their sudden marriage or his previous obscurity. To his surprise, most people seemed to accept this introduction without question, though Tom caught occasional speculative glances and whispered conversations that ceased when he approached. Catherine Bell always was. "Unconventional," he overheard one silver-haired woman remark to her companion. "But this takes the cake. He's young enough to be her son." "Handsome, though," her friend replied with a meaningful smile. "Can't blame her for wanting some company in that big house." Tom pretended not to hear, maintaining what he hoped was a dignified expression as he accompanied Catherine through her social rounds. He spoke when spoken to, danced one careful waltz with his wife when the occasion demanded it, and otherwise tried to blend into the background as much as possible. It was during a momentary separation, Catherine deep in conversation with a hospital board member, Tom taking refuge near a less crowded bar, that he encountered the first open hostility of the evening. "So you're the gold digger who landed the Bell fortune," a voice said at his elbow. Tom turned to find a man about his own age, expensively dressed and slightly flushed with alcohol, regarding him with undisguised contempt. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Tom replied evenly. "James Whitfield," the man said, not offering his hand. "Bell Railroad Company, Board of Directors. And known Catherine Bell a hell of a lot longer than you have, cowboy." Tom maintained his composure with effort. "Mr. Whitfield." "What's your angle?" Whitfield pressed, lowering his voice. "What's she paying you to play the devoted husband? Must be a pretty sum to make it worth sleeping with." "That's enough," Tom cut him off, his voice deadly quiet. "Mrs. Bell is my wife, and you'll speak of her with respect or not at all." Whitfield's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Touchy, aren't we? Hit a nerve, did I? Or is it just the money you're protective of? Tom set his glass down carefully, conscious that a scene would embarrass Catherine and undermine the image they were trying to project. Good evening, Mr. Whitfield, he said firmly and walked away, his heart pounding with restrained anger. He found Catherine still engaged with the hospital administrator, her expression pleasant, but her posture suggesting fatigue. Tom touched her elbow lightly. It's getting late, he murmured. Perhaps we should consider heading home. Catherine glanced at him, a question in her eyes, but nodded. You're right. It's been a lovely evening, Dr. Harrison, but we should be going. The drive home was silent, Catherine seemingly lost in thought. It wasn't until they were inside the mansion, the formal pretense no longer necessary, that she spoke. I saw you talking with James Whitfield, she said, her tone neutral. He looked upset when you left. Tom hesitated, reluctant to repeat Whitfield's crude insinuations. He was less than polite about our marriage. I imagine he was, Catherine replied dryly. James has been angling for a position as CEO of Bell Railroad for years. He likely sees you as a threat to his ambitions. Me? I don't know anything about railroads. No, but as my husband, you could theoretically influence company decisions. Catherine removed her evening wrap, handing it to Simmons, who had materialized silently to assist them. James believes himself entitled to control the Bell fortune by virtue of his business acumen and his long association with the company. Is he a relative? No, Catherine said shortly. Just an ambitious man who miscalculated his importance. She paused at the foot of the grand staircase. You handled yourself well tonight, Mr. Miller. Thank you. It was the closest thing to warmth she had shown him, and Tom found himself oddly moved by the simple acknowledgement. You're welcome. I hope I didn't embarrass you. On the contrary, Catherine said, you were a perfect gentleman, more than some who were born to the role. A ghost of a smile touched her lips before vanishing. Good night, Mr. Miller. Good night. Mrs. Bell, Tom replied, automatically using her preferred form of address. As he watched her ascend the stairs, straight-backed and dignified, despite what must have been an exhausting evening for a woman her age, Tom felt a confusing mix of emotions, respect for her composure, curiosity about her past, and an unexpected protectiveness that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. That night, Tom dreamed of Bell Creek Valley, Heaven's Pocket, as his grandfather had apparently called it. In the dream, he stood on the overlook while below him, the seasons changed in rapid succession, snow melting, wildflowers blooming, leaves turning gold, then falling. And beside him stood not Catherine, but a young woman with familiar eyes, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they watched the cycles of nature unfold below them. He woke, feeling unsettled, the dream images fading, but the emotional resonance lingering. Something about Catherine Bell and her connection to his family remained unexplained, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across decades of history he couldn't access. The next morning, Tom found a note slipped under his door. Not Catherine's. Elegant handwriting, but a different hand, the letters hurried and slightly irregular. The West Wing, third door on the right. She keeps her secrets there. Look while you can. There was no signature. Tom stared at the note for a long time, turning it over in his hands, trying to guess its origin. One of the staff, presumably. Someone with access to the house and knowledge of its layout. But why direct him to Catherine's private quarters? What secrets could be important enough to justify such an invasion of privacy? His first instinct was to ignore the note, perhaps even to show it to Catherine. But curiosity, that same need to understand that had driven him since childhood, made him tuck the paper into his pocket instead. That afternoon, opportunity presented itself when Catherine announced she would be meeting with her attorneys in Westridge and would not return until evening. As her car disappeared down the driveway, Tom felt the note burning in his pocket like a hot coal. He waited an hour, using the time to work on his conservation assessments, before finally setting down his pen and making his decision. He would look, not out of prurient curiosity, but because if he was tangled up in someone else's schemes, he deserved to know. The west wing of the mansion was Catherine's private domain, an area the staff treated with particular reverence and where Tom had never ventured. He made his way there casually, as if simply exploring the house, nodding to a maid who passed him in the hallway. The third door on the right was unremarkable, dark wood like all the others, no lock visible. Tom hesitated, hand on the doorknob, the sense of transgression acute. Then he turned the handle and stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The room was not what he had expected. Instead of a bedroom or private sitting room, it was a study, smaller and more intimate than Catherine's formal office. With a distinctly personal atmosphere, bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with the leather-bound classics that decorated the main library, but with well-used volumes on diverse subjects: botany, Montana history, poetry, land management. A large oak desk occupied the center of the room, its surface neat but not empty. A leather-bound journal lay open beside a wooden box, and on the walls, this is what made Tom's breath catch: photographs, dozens of them spanning decades, telling a story he had never imagined. Catherine as a young woman, smiling in a way he had never seen, standing beside a tall, serious-looking man, Robert Bell presumably. Catherine at various ages throughout her life. Landscapes Tom recognized from around Pine Creek and Westridge. And there, in a simple frame on a side table, a photograph that stopped Tom cold. A young Catherine, perhaps 20, standing beside a lean, handsome man in front of a small ranch house. The man had Tom's eyes, his grandfather's jawline, and the house, unmistakably the original structure of what would become the Sunrise Ranch farmhouse before his grandfather had expanded it in the 1950s. With trembling hands, Tom picked up the photograph. On the back, written in faded ink, James and Catherine, Heaven's Pocket, summer 1952. James, his grandfather's name. Tom set the photograph down carefully, his mind racing. Catherine had known his grandfather, not just casually, as she had, implied, but well enough to be photographed with him at what appeared to be a private moment. Well enough that someone had captured their image together and preserved it for 70 years. The leather journal on the desk drew his attention next. He hesitated, the invasion of privacy now feeling even more significant. But the need to understand overcame his scruples. The journal contained Catherine's private thoughts spanning decades, written in the same elegant hand as her notes to him. Tom flipped through pages at random, stopping when a familiar name caught his eye. June 15th, 1982, visited Sarah today. She's grown so beautiful, nearly 17 now. James says she's smart as a whip, talking about college. I left money for her education, though of course she doesn't know it's from me. Robert suspects nothing. It's better this way. Sarah, his mother's name. Tom's hand froze on the page. His mother, who had died when he was 4, leaving only fragmentary memories and a handful of photographs. His mother, who according to this entry, Catherine had visited secretly. Heart pounding, Tom continued reading, jumping forward through the journal. December 3rd, 1982. Sarah received her college acceptance letter today. James called to tell me, his voice proud despite his attempt to keep our conversation brief. I wanted to celebrate with them, to share in their joy. Instead, I sent an anonymous scholarship gift through the University Foundation. Always at a distance, always through intermediaries. Sometimes I wonder if this half-life is worth the pain. April 22nd, 1983. Robert asked about my spring charitable project today. If only he knew that my greatest charity has been toward him, allowing him to believe he is the only one I have ever loved, when my heart has lived a divided existence for decades. The entries continued, chronicling Catherine's mysterious connection to his family through the years. October 17th, 1986. Sarah's wedding today. I watched from the back of the church, just another community well-wisher. She was radiant. Her husband seems kind, steady. James says he works hard, has good prospects. The resemblance between Sarah and me at her age is startling. I wore a veil and sat in the last row to avoid notice. March 3rd, 1990. A grandson. Thomas James Miller, named for both grandfathers, though he'll never know the truth about one of them. I sent a silver cup, anonymous again. James thinks it's too dangerous for me to visit, even in secret. Robert's health is failing, and his suspicious nature has only grown with age. Tom staggered back from the desk, the journal falling from his hands. A grandson, named for both grandfathers. The implication was clear, yet so impossible that his mind struggled to accept it. Catherine Bell had not just known his grandfather, she had loved him. And somehow, that love had produced a child, Sarah, his mother, which would make Catherine Bell his grandmother. The wooden box still sat on the desk, untouched. With a sense of inevitability, Tom opened it, knowing what he might find even before he saw the contents. Inside lay letters, dozens of them exchanged between Catherine and his grandfather over decades. The earliest dated from 1952, the most recent from just 6 years ago, shortly before James Miller's death. Tom read fragments, pieces of a love story that had stretched across an entire lifetime. My dearest Kay, the spring planting is finished, and with each seed I place in the ground, I think of what might have been. If your parents had not interfered, if my prospects had been better, if the world were a different place, how different our lives would be. I carry the memory of last summer, like a talisman against loneliness. Dearest James, Robert's railroad business takes him to Chicago. Next month, I find myself counting the days until I can make my annual retreat to Pine Creek. The cabin at Heaven's Pocket is prepared. 3 weeks where we can pretend that the choices forced upon us were different. 3 weeks to love openly before returning to our separate lives. My beloved Kay. Sarah asked about her mother again today. She's 12 now, too old for the simple stories that satisfied her as a child. I told her that her mother was beautiful and kind and loved her very much, but had to go away. The truth as far as it goes. Margaret has been a good stepmother, but a child knows when something is missing from their story. Tom sat heavily in Catherine's desk chair, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. Catherine and his grandfather had been lovers, their relationship stretching back to the early 1950s. Catherine had become pregnant, but her parents, presumably wealthy and status-conscious, had forced her to marry Robert Bell instead. James Miller had raised their daughter as his own, with his wife Margaret acting as stepmother. Sarah Miller, Tom's mother, had been Catherine Bell's daughter, and Catherine Bell was Tom's biological grandmother. The sound of a car in the driveway jolted Tom back to the present. Catherine was returning early. Hastily, he replaced the letters in the box, set the journal back in its original position, and straightened the photographs he had disturbed. He slipped out of the study and made his way quickly back to the East Wing, his mind reeling with revelations. As he sat in his own suite, waiting for the inevitable summons, Tom tried to process what he had discovered. The marriage of convenience, the interest in his ranch, the conservation project, all of it took on new meaning in light of the truth. Catherine hadn't chosen him randomly for her scheme. She had orchestrated the entire situation to help her grandson, while maintaining the secret she had kept for 70 years. The question was, what would he do with this knowledge? When the expected knock came at his door an hour later, Tom had composed himself as best he could. Simmons stood in the hallway, his expression as impassive as ever. "Mrs. Bell requests your presence in the sunroom, Mr. Miller." "Thank you, Simmons. I'll be right down." Catherine was standing at the windows when Tom entered, her back to the door, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. Without turning, she spoke. "You went into my private study." It wasn't a question. Tom didn't bother denying it. "Yes, and you read my journal, looked at my photographs, examined my letters." "Yes." Catherine turned then, her face composed but her eyes sharp with something Tom couldn't identify. Anger, perhaps, or fear, or some complex emotion he had no name for. "Why?" Tom reached into his pocket and produced the anonymous note. "Someone wanted me to find them." Catherine took the note, examined it briefly, then set it aside. "One of the staff, no doubt. There has always been speculation about my past, about my connection to Pine Creek." "Is it true?" Tom asked directly. "Was my mother your daughter?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Yes." The simple admission spoken aloud made the reality impossible to deny. Tom found himself studying Catherine's face with new eyes, looking for traces of his mother, of himself. Why the charade? He done this marriage, the business arrangement. Why not just tell me the truth? Catherine moved to a chair and sat, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. After a moment's hesitation, Tom took the seat across from her. "Would you have believed me?" Catherine asked. "A wealthy stranger appearing at your door, claiming to be your grandmother, offering financial rescue with no apparent motive. Or would you have assumed I was attempting to manipulate you, perhaps suffering from dementia, or running some elaborate confidence scheme?" Tom had to admit she had a point. "You could have provided proof." "And then what?" Catherine's voice held a trace of bitterness. "Would you have accepted help from a grandmother who abandoned your mother, who lived in luxury while your family struggled, who maintained her secret for 70 years because it was more convenient than acknowledging the truth?" The questions hung in the air between them, uncomfortable in their accuracy. Tom had no ready answer. "I thought it would be easier," Catherine continued after a moment. "A business arrangement, clear and defined. You would get what you needed. Financial security, the preservation of your family's legacy. I would get what I needed, the chance to help you without having to face the consequences of my past choices." "What happens now?" Tom asked, the immediate question uppermost in his mind. "That depends on you," Catherine replied. "Our legal arrangement stands. The financial provisions for your ranch are already in place, irrevocable. The only thing that has changed is what you know." She paused, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I will understand if you wish to end our association immediately, once the necessary legal work for the conservation project is complete." Tom studied the woman before him, proud, reserved, carrying secrets that had shaped multiple generations. His grandmother, a stranger, both at once. "I need time," he said finally, "to process all this." Catherine nodded, the slight movement dignified even in its restraint. "Of course." As Tom rose to leave, a question occurred to him. "Does anyone else know about our connection?" "No one living," Catherine said. "Robert suspected, I think, toward the end, but he never confronted me directly. I believe he preferred the comforting fiction to the painful truth." Tom nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. That night, sleep eluded him entirely. Tom paced his suite, mind churning with implications and unanswered questions. The foundations of his identity had been shaken. The story of his family, who they were, where he came from, was fundamentally different from what he had always believed, yet some things remained constant. His grandfather, still his grandfather, even if the connection was emotional rather than biological, had loved him, raised him, taught him the values he still held dear. His mother, though he had few memories of her, had been real and present for the brief years of his childhood. And Catherine Bell, for all her secrecy and manipulation, had acted out of some complex mixture of love, guilt, and desire to make amends. The conservation project, Tom now realized, was not merely about environmental preservation, but about protecting places that held personal significance. Heaven's Pocket, where she and James Miller had found their brief happiness. By dawn, Tom had reached no firm conclusions beyond the immediate practicalities. He would continue the conservation work, which was worthwhile regardless of the personal complications. He would maintain the public fiction of their marriage, as agreed. For 3 days after the revelation, Tom and Catherine orbited each other cautiously, maintaining surface politeness while avoiding any discussion of their newly discovered connection. They spoke about the conservation project, about household matters, about innocuous current events, never about the journals, the letters, or the photographs that had exposed 70 years of secrets. On the morning of the 4th day, Tom found Catherine in the estate's greenhouse, a glass-walled sanctuary attached to the east side of the mansion. Despite the winter chill outside, the interior was warm and humid, filled with orchids, tropical ferns, and flowering plants Tom couldn't name. Catherine stood at a wooden potting bench, hands encased in dirt-stained gloves as she transplanted seedlings into larger pots. She looked up at his approach, her expression guarded. "Mr. Miller, I think under the circumstances you might call me Tom," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. Something flickered across Catherine's face. Surprise, perhaps, or caution. "Very well, Tom." The name sounded strange in her formal voice, but it was a beginning. Tom gestured to the plants. "I didn't know you gardened." "For over 60 years, Catherine replied, returning her attention to the delicate seedling in her hands. "Robert built this greenhouse as a wedding gift. It's always been my refuge." Tom moved closer, examining the neat rows of plants. "My mother gardened too. Nothing like this, just vegetables and a few flowers, but she loved it. One of the few clear memories I have of her is helping her plant sunflower seeds along the fence line." Catherine's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. Sarah always loved sunflowers, even as a little girl. Her voice held a tentative quality, as if testing whether such personal observations were permitted. "Tell me about her," Tom said, making his decision. "Please." Catherine set down her trowel, removing her gloves with deliberate care. For a moment, Tom thought she might refuse or deflect the request. Instead, she gestured to a wrought iron bench nestled among potted palms. "She had your determination," Catherine began once they were seated, "and your eyes, though I suppose those are James's eyes, really. Stubborn, brilliant, kinder than she needed to be." She paused, her gaze distant. "I only saw her a few times each year, always in secret, always with the understanding that I was a family friend, nothing more." "Did she ever suspect?" Tom asked. Catherine shook her head. "James and I agreed. It was better she never know. Robert was powerful, vindictive when crossed. If the truth had come out, he could have destroyed James financially, taken Sunrise Ranch through legal maneuvering or banking pressure, and Sarah would have been caught in the middle of an ugly scandal. So you watched her grow up from a distance." "Yes." The word held decades of regret. "I helped where I could, anonymously. College funds, wedding gifts, medical expenses when she was pregnant with you. And after she died?" Catherine's composure wavered for the first time since Tom had known her. "I wanted to take you, to bring you here, raise you myself." James refused, said you belonged at Sunrise Ranch with your roots, your heritage. Said Robert would never accept a child he didn't father, especially one who would remind him every day of my decades-long deception. The admission hung in the humid greenhouse air. Tom tried to imagine an alternate life, growing up in this mansion, surrounded by wealth and privilege, raised by this complex, reserved woman, instead of by his grandfather and the succession of housekeepers who had tried to fill the maternal gap in his early years. "I think my grandfather was right," Tom said finally. "Sunrise Ranch made me who I am." Catherine nodded, a slight but definite gesture of acceptance. James was a wise man, usually wiser than I was. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "We were so young when it began, 19 and 21, too young to understand what we were risking." "How did you meet?" "At a community dance in Pine Creek. My father owned the general store and we lived above it. James had just taken over the ranch from his father. He asked me to dance and—" Catherine trailed off, the memory visibly affecting her. "By the end of that summer, we were in love, making plans, but my parents had different ideas." "They forced you to marry Robert Bell instead," Tom prompted. Urged strongly, let's say. Robert was nearly 40 then, a successful businessman with political connections and social standing. My father was ambitious, eager to see his daughter make a good match. My mother was practical. She saw security in Robert's wealth that James's small ranch couldn't provide. "But you continued seeing my grandfather, even after you were married?" Catherine's chin lifted slightly, a hint of defiance in her otherwise composed demeanor. "Once a year for 3 weeks, when Robert traveled to Chicago on business. We met at a cabin near Bell Creek Valley, what James called Heaven's Pocket. It wasn't much, but it was ours. When I discovered I was pregnant, there was no question whose child it was. Robert and I had separate bedrooms by then, a marriage of convenience on both sides, and he never suspected. He was often away. I managed to hide the pregnancy until it became necessary to visit relatives in the East. I gave birth in Boston, gave Sarah to James to raise as his own, and returned to Montana months later, supposedly recovered from a prolonged illness." Catherine's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held the pain of ancient wounds. James had just married Margaret by then, a hasty arrangement to provide a mother for Sarah, a good woman who raised another woman's child without complaint. Tom absorbed this history, his history, in silence. The story was both intimate and remote, concerning people he'd known and people he'd never met, choices made before his birth that had shaped his entire existence. "Why are you telling me all this now?" he asked finally. Catherine regarded him steadily. "Because you asked. Because you deserve the truth. And because at 70, I've discovered that secrets weigh more heavily with each passing year." The simple honesty of the response touched Tom unexpectedly. He studied the woman before him, his grandmother, this stranger he was legally married to, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not just the wealthy widow, not just the business associate, but a person who had lived a divided life for decades, making choices both selfish and selfless, carrying burdens and regrets he could only begin to comprehend. "Thank you," he said, simply, "for the truth." Catherine inclined her head in acknowledgement, then rose, reaching for her gardening gloves. "We have a meeting with the environmental assessment team at 1. I should prepare." Tom recognized the retreat behind the familiar veil of business and practicality. He didn't push for more, sensing that this conversation had cost Catherine emotionally in ways she wouldn't readily show. "I'll see you at lunch," he said, allowing her the space she clearly needed. That evening, Tom worked late in his suite, finalizing recommendations for the Bell Creek Valley Preservation Plan. The conservation project had taken on deeper significance, now that he understood its personal importance to Catherine, and by extension, to his own family history. Heaven's Pocket, the site of his grandparents' secret relationship, would be protected in perpetuity, a legacy more enduring than any fortune or property. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Harper, the housekeeper, her expression concerned. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Bell asked me to inform you that she's not feeling well and has retired early. She sends her regrets that she won't be joining you for dinner." Tom frowned. "Is she ill? Should we call a doctor?" "Dr. Reynolds has already been contacted," Mrs. Harper assured him. "He's with her now. She asked not to be disturbed otherwise." "Thank you for letting me know," Tom said, troubled by the sudden development. After Mrs. Harper left, Tom paced his suite restlessly. The timing of Catherine's illness, coming immediately after their emotionally charged conversation, seemed unlikely to be coincidence. Had the stress of confronting long-buried secrets affected her health, or was this simply a convenient way to avoid further personal discussions? His concern grew when Catherine failed to appear at breakfast the next morning and again at lunch. When he inquired, Simmons informed him that Mrs. Bell was resting on doctor's orders and would likely remain in her quarters for several days. "Did Dr. Reynolds say what's wrong?" Tom pressed. "I believe it's a recurrence of a previous condition," Simmons replied, his professional demeanor impenetrable. "Mrs. Bell has left instructions for you to continue with the conservation project in her absence. All necessary resources remain at your disposal." Tom nodded, accepting the information while suspecting there was more to the situation than he was being told. The staff's practiced discretion, normally merely annoying, now felt like a barrier between him and important knowledge about Catherine's welfare. 3 days passed with no direct communication from Catherine. Tom continued his work on the conservation project, meeting with lawyers and environmental consultants. But his concern deepened with each meal she missed and each inquiry that was politely deflected by the staff. On the evening of the 3rd day, unable to tolerate the uncertainty any longer, Tom made his way to the West Wing. This time, he didn't seek the study with its revealing documents, but continued further down the hallway where he presumed Catherine's. Private quarters must be located. A maid emerging from one of the rooms looked startled to see him. "Mr. Miller, can I help you?" "I'd like to see Mrs. Bell," Tom said firmly. "Which room is hers?" The young woman hesitated, clearly torn between his authority as Catherine's husband and her loyalty to her employer's desire for privacy. Mrs. Bell left instructions not to be disturbed. "I understand. But as her husband, I'm concerned about her health," Tom pressed, infusing his voice with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "I won't stay long." The maid's resistance crumbled. The double doors at the end of the hall. "But please, sir, she really hasn't been well." Tom thanked her and continued to the indicated doors. He knocked softly, then more firmly when no response came. Finally, he tried the handle, finding it unlocked. The room beyond was spacious and elegantly appointed. A sitting room rather than a bedroom, with bookshelves, comfortable seating, and large windows overlooking the estate's grounds. A fire burned low in the grate, casting shifting shadows across the Persian rug. Catherine sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, a blanket across her lap despite the room's warmth. She looked up as Tom entered, her expression a mixture of surprise and resignation. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice weaker than Tom remembered. "I was worried," he replied simply, approaching but stopping at a respectful distance. "No one would tell me what was wrong." Catherine sighed, gesturing to a nearby chair in reluctant invitation. "Because I instructed them not to." Tom sat, studying her with concern. Catherine looked pale, the lines in her face more pronounced than just days earlier. "Are you ill? Really ill, I mean?" "Yes and no," Catherine replied after a moment. "I have a heart condition. Manageable usually, but stress can exacerbate the symptoms. Dr. Reynolds has adjusted my medication and recommended rest." "Our conversation in the greenhouse," Tom said, understanding dawning. "It caused this." "Not directly," Catherine qualified, "but perhaps the emotional strain contributed." Tom felt a wave of guilt. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pushed for answers." "Don't apologize for seeking truth," Catherine said, a spark of her usual forcefulness returning. "I've lived with secrets long enough to know they're often more damaging than honesty." Silence fell between them, more comfortable than previous silences had been. Catherine stared into the fire, her thoughts visibly turning inward. "I had a letter from James," she said finally. "The day after your father's funeral. He wrote that you'd refused a college scholarship to stay and help with the ranch, that you were determined to preserve your family's legacy at any cost." She looked up, meeting Tom's gaze directly. "I recognize myself in that description. The same stubborn pride, the same devotion to place and heritage. But is that why you chose this particular way to help me?" Tom asked. "The marriage arrangement." Catherine's lips curved in a slight smile. "Partly. I'd been looking for a way to ensure Sunrise Ranch stayed in the family. When I learned of your financial troubles, this solution presented itself. The marriage gives me legal means to transfer assets without raising questions about my motives. As my husband, you can receive property and funds that would be scrutinized if given to a supposedly unrelated young man. Couldn't you have just bought the ranch's debt and forgiven it?" "Not without explanations I wasn't prepared to make," Catherine said. "Robert's family still holds significant influence in banking circles. Questions would have been asked, connections potentially made." Tom considered this, understanding the logic, even as the complexity of the arrangement still struck him as extreme. "And the conservation project, is that real or just an excuse to have me here?" "Very real," Catherine assured him. "Those lands need protection, regardless of personal considerations. Your expertise has been genuinely valuable." She hesitated, then added, "But yes, I also wanted an opportunity to know you, even if only as a business associate." The admission touched Tom unexpectedly. He tried to imagine Catherine's perspective, watching her grandson from a distance. For decades, never acknowledged, never able to claim a relationship that might have brought comfort to them both. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," he said quietly. Catherine's expression softened, vulnerability showing through her usual reserve. "We make the choices available to us at the time, then live with the consequences. I chose Robert over James. Initially, security over love. Every decision that followed stemmed from that first choice." Tom found himself wanting to offer some comfort, unsure how it would be received by this proud, private woman. "You also chose to help when you could, even from a distance. That counts for something." "Perhaps." Catherine looked tired suddenly, the conversation visibly taking a toll. "I should let you rest," Tom said, rising. Catherine nodded, then said unexpectedly, "There's a box in my study on the bottom shelf of the bookcase nearest the window. Family photographs. You might want to look through them." Tom recognized the offering for what it was, a gesture of trust, an invitation to learn more about the family connections that had been hidden from him. "Thank you. I'd like that." That night, Tom sat in Catherine's study with the box of photographs spread before him. Images spanning decades told the story his words alone couldn't convey. Catherine as a young woman, radiant with youth and promise. His grandfather James in his prime, tall and confident. His mother Sarah growing from a solemn child to a beautiful young woman with Tom's own eyes. Most poignant were the photographs clearly taken during those secret annual meetings at Heaven's Pocket. Catherine and James, aging through the years but always standing close, their connection visible despite the careful distance they maintained before the camera. Background details showed the changing seasons, the evolving landscape, the passing decades marked in clothing styles and graying hair. The last photograph in the collection showed James and Catherine in their 60s, standing at the overlook above Bell Creek Valley, snow-capped mountains behind them. They weren't touching, but the way they leaned toward each other spoke of an intimacy that had endured despite all obstacles. Tom studied his grandparents' faces, searching for traces of himself in their features, their expressions. The resemblance to James was strong. Tom had his height, his jawline, the set of his shoulders, but there was something of Catherine, too, in the shape of his eyes, the angle of his cheekbones. Genetics aside, Tom felt a deeper connection forming, an understanding of the complex, flawed, resilient people whose choices had ultimately led to his existence. Neither saints nor villains, but human beings navigating love, duty, and circumstance as best they could. When he finally returned the photographs to their box, Tom felt changed in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The anger and confusion he had initially felt upon discovering Catherine's deception had mellowed into something more nuanced. Not forgiveness exactly, but comprehension. The next morning, Catherine appeared at breakfast for the first time in days, pale but composed. She nodded to Tom as she took her seat, accepting a cup of tea from Simmons with murmured thanks. "You're feeling better," Tom observed. "Well enough to resume normal activities with some limitations," Catherine replied. "Dr. Reynolds has advised against unnecessary exertion for the time being." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the awkwardness of previous meals notably absent. Finally, Catherine set down her teacup and gave Tom a direct look. "Thank you for respecting my privacy during my indisposition." Tom knew she was referring not just to her illness, but to the deeper revelations they had shared. "You're welcome. I assume you found the photographs interesting." "Very," Tom acknowledged, "especially those from Heaven's Pocket." Catherine nodded, a distant expression crossing her face. "James insisted on documenting those times, said memories fade, but photographs remain. I thought it reckless then, keeping evidence of our relationship. Now I'm grateful for his foresight." "He must have loved you very much," Tom said quietly. "We loved each other," Catherine corrected gently. "Through separations, marriages to others, all the complications life imposed. Not an easy love, or a convenient one, but enduring." Tom considered the extraordinary devotion implied by those words. A relationship maintained in secret for nearly 70 years, surviving obstacles that would have destroyed most connections. "I'd like to see it," he said impulsively. "Heaven's Pocket, the cabin if it's still there." Catherine looked surprised, then thoughtful. "The cabin was lost in a forest fire 15 years ago, but the location, yes, I could show you. When I'm stronger, I'd appreciate that." Their conversation was interrupted by Simmons, who entered bearing a silver tray with a telephone. "Excuse me, Mrs. Bell. Mr. Whitfield is calling. He says it's urgent." Catherine's expression cooled immediately. "James Whitfield can wait. I'm having breakfast with my husband." "He insists it concerns an emergency board meeting being called. In for tomorrow," Simmons persisted, "regarding land sales." Catherine's gaze sharpened. "What land sales?" "He wouldn't specify, madam, only that it requires your immediate attention." Catherine sighed, reaching for the phone with evident reluctance. "Excuse me, Tom, this won't take long." As she spoke into the receiver, her demeanor transformed from the almost vulnerable woman of their recent conversations back into the formidable Catherine Bell, railroad heiress and businesswoman. Her voice became crisp, authoritative, her questions precise and demanding. Tom watched the change with fascination, glimpsing yet another facet of this complex woman who was his grandmother, his business partner, and technically his wife. When Catherine hung up, her expression was troubled. "It seems James Whitfield has been busy in my absence. He's called an emergency board meeting to approve the sale of several land parcels owned by Bell Railroad, including Bell Creek Valley." "Hey, can he do that?" Tom asked, alarmed. "I thought you controlled the company." "I own controlling interest," Catherine corrected, "but major decisions require board approval. Normally a formality, but if enough board members align against me..." She frowned, calculations visibly running behind her eyes. "Whitfield has been consolidating support while I've been indisposed, taking advantage of my illness to push through a deal I've blocked for years. What can we do?" Catherine's gaze focused on Tom with new intensity. "We attend the meeting tomorrow and stop him together." Tom blinked, surprised by the inclusive phrasing. "Me? What could I contribute to a railroad board meeting?" "You're my husband," Catherine said simply. "And more importantly, you're the environmental consultant I've hired to assess these properties. Your expertise gives you standing to address the board." "But I'm not an expert," Tom protested. "Not really." "You know more than you give yourself credit for," Catherine countered. "And you care about the outcome in ways that will be persuasive. Besides," she added with the ghost of a smile, "your presence will irritate Whitfield immensely, which is its own reward." Tom couldn't help but smile at that, recognizing the flash of steel beneath Catherine's refined exterior. "When and where is this meeting?" "Westridge, 10 tomorrow morning, Bell Railroad headquarters." Catherine rose from the table with renewed energy. "We'll need to prepare thoroughly. Join me in my office after you've finished breakfast. We have work to do." The rest of the day passed in intense preparation. Catherine proved to be a formidable strategist, analyzing the board's composition, each member's potential motivations, and the likely arguments Whitfield would present. Tom contributed his own knowledge of the land parcels in question, particularly Bell Creek Valley, refining his conservation assessment into points that would resonate with business-minded board members. "The key," Catherine explained as they worked, "is to present conservation not as sentimental environmentalism, but as sound long-term business strategy. Tax advantages, public relations benefits, protection against future regulatory complications." Tom nodded, understanding the approach. "Speak their language." "Exactly." Catherine pushed a document across the desk. "These are the financial projections for the resort development Whitfield is proposing. Notice anything?" Tom studied the figures, his brow furrowing. "The revenue estimates seem inflated, and these construction costs are way below market rate for mountain terrain." "Precisely," Catherine said with approval. "Whitfield's numbers don't add up. He's promising the board a return they're unlikely to realize. We need to expose that discrepancy." As they worked into the evening, Tom found himself admiring Catherine's sharp intelligence and strategic mind. She anticipated objections, prepared counters, assembled a case that was simultaneously emotional and pragmatic. At 70, despite her recent illness, her mental acuity remained impressive. "You enjoy this," Tom observed during a break for coffee. "The strategy, the maneuvering." Catherine considered this, then nodded. "I've spent 50 years in a man's business world, Tom. Learning to outthink opponents became second nature. Robert taught me well, though he might be dismayed by how I've applied those lessons." "Your husband, Robert, what was he like?" Tom asked, realizing he knew almost nothing about the man whose name Catherine had borne for most of her life. Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. "Brilliant, driven, cold in some ways, but not cruel. We had what you might call a partnership, of mutual respect rather than a love match." He wanted a socially appropriate wife who could manage his household and advance his business interests through connections and diplomacy. I wanted security and purpose after my hopes with James were dashed. Did you ever regret marrying him? Regret is a luxury that accomplishes nothing, Catherine said firmly. I made my choice and lived with it. Robert gave me a life of privilege and opportunity. I gave him loyalty and competence. We were well matched in most ways that mattered. Except for your heart being elsewhere, Tom suggested gently. Catherine's gaze turned distant. Yes, except for that. After a moment, she refocused on the documents before them. We should finalize these projections before tomorrow. Tom recognized the deflection, but didn't press further. They returned to their preparations, working until Catherine's fatigue became evident despite her attempts to hide it. We should stop for tonight, Tom said, gathering papers into organized stacks. You need rest before tomorrow. Catherine looked about to protest, then conceded with a nod. You're right. We've covered the essentials. She rose, straightening papers with practiced precision. Thank you for your assistance today, Tom. Your perspective has been valuable. Thank you for trusting me with this, Tom replied. I know how important Bell Creek Valley is to you, beyond its environmental significance. Catherine paused, her hands stilling on the documents. Heaven's Pocket isn't just a sentimental location, though it is that too. It's one of the last undeveloped watersheds in the region. Its protection matters beyond my personal history. I understand, Tom assured her. Both reasons are valid. Catherine studied him for a moment, then said unexpectedly, You have much of James in you, his integrity, his connection to the land. The observation, delivered without sentimentality, but with evident sincerity, touched Tom deeply. Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. It was intended as one, Catherine replied with quiet dignity. Good night, Tom. As she left the office, Tom noticed with concern that her steps were slower than usual, her posture less rigidly straight. Tomorrow's confrontation would tax her strength, especially so soon after her recent illness. Yet he sensed that nothing, short of physical collapse, would prevent Catherine from defending Bell Creek Valley, Heaven's Pocket, from development. The Bell Railroad Company headquarters occupied a stately brick building in downtown Westridge, its architecture harkening back to the early 20th century when the railroad had transformed Montana's economy. Inside, however, the offices were thoroughly modern, sleek, corporate, and impersonal. Tom accompanied Catherine through the lobby, conscious of the curious glances from employees who clearly recognized the company's owner but were unaccustomed to seeing her with a much younger male companion. Catherine navigated the space with the confidence of long familiarity, nodding to staff members but stopping for no one. The boardroom occupied the top floor, a wood-paneled space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Westridge and the mountains beyond. A massive table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs currently occupied by 11 men and 1 woman, all in business attire, all watching Catherine's entrance with expressions ranging from respect to barely concealed hostility. James Whitfield sat at the far end of the table, positioned as if to challenge Catherine's authority. He frowned at the sight of Tom, leaning to whisper something to the grey-haired man beside him. "Good morning," Catherine said, taking her place, at the head of the table with Tom seated to her right. "I understand this emergency meeting was called without consulting me, which is irregular to say the least." Whitfield straightened, smoothing his tie with manicured hands. "We were concerned about your health, Catherine. Given your recent indisposition, we thought it best to proceed with time-sensitive business matters rather than burden you unnecessarily." The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but Tom noticed the slight tightening of her hands on the folder before her. "How considerate," she replied coolly. However, as I'm present now and apparently in better health than rumored, perhaps you could explain why land sales that have been under discussion for years suddenly require emergency action. Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. Market conditions primarily. We've received an exceptional offer from Pinnacle Resorts for the Bell Creek Valley property and several adjacent parcels. Their proposal includes a world-class ski resort, luxury condominiums, and golf courses. The projected revenue would significantly enhance shareholder value. At what cost to the watershed and wildlife corridors? Catherine countered. Bell Creek Valley feeds water systems across 3 counties. Development on the scale Pinnacle proposes would have far-reaching environmental consequences. With all due respect, Whitfield said, the phrase dripping with insincerity, the board's primary responsibility is to the company's financial health, not environmental sentiment. Pinnacle's offer represents a 30% premium over assessed land value, based on projections that don't withstand scrutiny, Tom interjected, opening the folder Catherine had prepared for him. If I may, Whitfield frowned. And you are? Thomas Miller, Catherine replied before Tom could speak. My husband and the environmental consultant I've engaged to assess these properties. His expertise is directly relevant to this discussion. Whispers circulated around the table. Clearly, Tom's presence was unexpected. His role as Catherine's husband still novelty enough to cause reaction. I wasn't aware spouses were permitted at board meetings, Whitfield said stiffly. Mr. Miller isn't here as my spouse, Catherine corrected. He's here as a consultant with relevant expertise, unless you'd prefer the board make decisions without complete information. The older man beside Whitfield, introduced as Ronald Hayes, the board's longest-serving member, cleared his throat. I believe we should hear Mr. Miller's assessment. The more information at our disposal, the better our decision-making. Whitfield subsided with visible reluctance. Tom took the opening, presenting the analysis he and Catherine had prepared, the flawed financial projections, the environmental impact assessments, the long-term liabilities development would create. He spoke with growing confidence, drawing on his genuine concern for the land as well as the technical knowledge he'd acquired through weeks of study. In summary, he concluded, the Pinnacle proposal offers short-term gain at the expense of long-term value and significant environmental degradation. The alternative conservation plan provides tax advantages, positive public relations, and preserves the land's inherent value while protecting critical water resources. Silence fell as Tom finished. He glanced at Catherine, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod of approval. Whitfield recovered quickly, launching into a rebuttal that emphasized corporate responsibility to shareholders and dismissed environmental concerns as secondary. The debate continued, with board members asking questions, raising objections, and gradually revealing their positions through their inquiries. Throughout the discussion, Catherine remained composed but forceful, her familiarity with both the business and the land apparent in her responses. Tom contributed where appropriate but primarily observed her in action, impressed by her command of the room despite being significantly older than most present, and the only woman besides the company's legal counsel. The turning point came when Ronald Hayes, after listening to both sides, addressed Catherine directly. I've known you for 30 years, Catherine. You've never been one for sentimentality in business matters. What makes these particular parcels so important? Catherine met his gaze steadily. I've spent my life building this company into something that will outlast all of us. Part of that legacy should be stewardship of the resources that made Bell Railroad possible in the first place. The timber, the water, the land itself. These aren't expendable assets, but the foundation of sustainable prosperity. She paused, then continued with quiet intensity. Bell Creek Valley in particular represents An ecological system so perfectly balanced that damage to it would ripple through communities for generations. I've walked every acre of that land. I know what's at stake. This isn't about sentiment, Ronald. It's about responsibility. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I've always respected your judgment, Catherine. If you believe conservation is the better path for these properties, I'm inclined to support that position. Whitfield's expression darkened as he recognized the tide turning against him. This is absurd. We're leaving millions on the table because Catherine Bell has developed a sudden passion for trees and wildlife. Or is there another reason she's so attached to these particular properties? His gaze flicked meaningfully to Tom. Perhaps her recent marriage has clouded her business judgment. The insinuation hung in the air, a calculated attempt to undermine Catherine's authority by suggesting her decisions were emotionally or romantically influenced rather than strategically sound. Before Catherine could respond, Tom spoke, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. If you're implying that Mrs. Bell's business judgment has been compromised, Mr. Whitfield, I'd suggest examining your own proposal more carefully. The Pinnacle offer benefits certain board members disproportionately through ancillary development contracts coincidentally held by companies in which you have significant interest. A stunned silence fell over the room. Catherine shot Tom a surprised glance. This was information they hadn't discussed, not part of their prepared strategy. Whitfield's face flushed with anger. That's an outrageous accusation. Is it? Tom interrupted, pulling a document from his folder. Public records show that Meridian Development, which holds exclusive contracts with Pinnacle Resorts, lists you as a principal investor. Either you failed to disclose this conflict of interest to the board, or they were already aware of it when considering your proposal. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted palpably as board members exchanged glances, some concerned, others clearly uncomfortable. Ronald Hayes frowned deeply, turning toward Whitfield with new scrutiny. "Is this true, James?" he demanded. "Do you have a financial interest in Pinnacle's development plans beyond your role as a board member?" Whitfield's composure cracked. "A minor investment, nothing that would influence—" "Nothing minor about 15% ownership," Tom countered, having done his research thoroughly the previous night while Catherine slept. "Or about the $3 million you stand to make personally if this deal goes through." The revelation effectively ended Whitfield's offensive. The board, now alert to potential impropriety, began asking pointed questions about the Pinnacle, proposal's origins, and Whitfield's role in bringing it forward. Catherine, seizing the advantage, called for a formal vote on placing the properties into a conservation trust instead. The motion passed 8-4, with Whitfield and his closest allies outvoted by the board majority, who chose to align with Catherine's vision and to distance themselves from what now appeared to be a potentially inappropriate deal. As the meeting adjourned, board members filtered out, some stopping to speak briefly with Catherine, others departing quickly to avoid the uncomfortable aftermath of Whitfield's exposure. Tom remained seated, watching Catherine handle each interaction with gracious authority, showing neither triumph nor resentment. Whitfield was the last to leave, pausing beside Catherine with barely contained fury. "This isn't over," he said, voice low enough that only she and Tom could hear. "You won't be around forever to protect your pet projects." Catherine regarded him with cool dignity. "Perhaps not. But I'm here today, James, and today Bell Creek Valley was saved from your greed. I consider that victory enough for one morning." After Whitfield stormed out, Catherine turned to Tom, her composed expression giving way to genuine curiosity. "How did you discover Whitfield's connection to Meridian Development? That wasn't in our research." Tom smiled slightly. "I did some additional digging last night. Public record searches, corporate filings. Growing up on a ranch teaches you to be thorough when checking for problems. Catherine's lips curved in a rare smile of unguarded approval. Impressive and decisive. Whitfield didn't expect to be exposed so publicly. 3 days after the board meeting, Catherine finally revealed the truth Tom had suspected. She was dying. Her heart condition wasn't minor, but terminal, the real reason behind their unusual arrangement. With this revelation, everything shifted. Their business partnership evolved into something genuine. Tom spending his remaining time with Catherine, not out of obligation, but connection. She shared stories of his mother Sarah, of secret meetings with his grandfather, of a love that spanned decades despite impossible circumstances. When Catherine passed peacefully in May, Tom honored her final wish, burying her at Heaven's Pocket where she'd been happiest. 5 years later, Sunrise Ranch thrived as a sustainable agriculture center, while Oakwood Estate became an educational facility. Tom's young daughter, named Catherine Sarah, would grow up knowing her family's complete history. Standing at sunset, watching his child marvel at the Montana sky, Tom reflected on what Catherine had truly left him, not just money or land, but understanding of who he was and where he belonged. Some fortunes couldn't be measured in dollars, but in truth and connection across generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.